Hello friends, good morning everyone. So in our previous class we have discussed about the cerebrum, the features, means the borders and surfaces we have discussed. And today we are going to discuss about the depressions and the projections. Okay, don't worry about these things. So the depressions, if you just look at the brain, we can identify some depressions. So here we are seeing the skull. So we are going to remove the skull vault and going to enter into the deep to identify the brain, and we are going to explore the brain. Okay, so let me show you now. Coming to this point is here you can see some depressions and as well as the projections. So this is the brain, the cerebrum we can identify over here. So on the cerebrum, so entire the surface as we have discussed in the previous class called as the superolateral surface. So on the superolateral surface we can identify so many depressions, not only on the superolateral, even on the medial surface and even at the inferior surface you can identify the depressions and as well as the projections. So the depressions here we can identify, they are called as the sulci, and the projections, these projections are called as the gyri. Okay, so the depressions are called as sulci and the projections are called as gyri. Okay, just wait for a while. I will show you all the sulci and I will explain you from where to where they are extending. Yes, coming to the main sulci of the brain, first one we are going to discuss about the Central Sulcus of Rolando. Okay, let me show you this Central Sulcus of Rolando. So the Central Sulcus of Rolando, here you can identify this, is the Central Sulcus. So this Central Sulcus, which is a limiting sulcus. Okay, so this limiting sulcus, why it is called as limiting sulcus? Because try to listen carefully. Why it is called as limiting sulcus? Because the central sulcus is an example of limiting sulcus because it separates the agranular motor cortex in front. It separates agranular motor cortex in front. So this in front of the central sulcus, it is agranular motor cortex. Okay, agranular agranular motor cortex, and behind this part is it is granular central or granular sensory cortex. Granular sensory cortex, which is present behind, a granular motor cortex is present in front. Okay, so as it is separating the motor in front, sensory behind, it is called as the limiting sulcus. It is called as limiting sulcus. Okay, so what is the name of this limiting sulcus? Central sulcus of Rolando. This is the central sulcus of Rolando. Okay, so it is exactly, let me show you this from where to where it is extending. So the central sulcus exactly, it is rising, extending from the medial surface, and then it is extending into the superolateral surface. Then it is present between the frontal pole anteriorly, occipital pole behind. Okay, occipital pole behind, just rostral to the upturned end of cingulate sulcus on the medial surface. Let me show you that upturned end of cingulate sulcus. Okay, so the cingulate sulcus which is present over here, yes, here you can identify this sulcus. So just rostral to the cingulate sulcus, you can identify the Central Sulcus of Rolando, Central Sulcus of Rolando, and it is extending into the superolateral surface, and it is running downwards, forwards, and laterally. Okay, downwards, forwards, and laterally, making an angle about 70 degrees within the median sagittal plane. Its lower end lies slightly above the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, or it is also called as Sylvian fissure. Okay, so this central sulcus of Rolando, which is extending from the medial surface and then it is extending into the superolateral surface, and running downwards, forwards, and laterally, and reaching to the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. It is just lying above the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. So this is about the central sulcus of Rolando. Then coming to the lateral sulcus. So this lateral sulcus, it is also called as Sylvian fissure or Sylvian sulcus. Sometimes you may get this question Sylvian sulcus. So Sylvian sulcus is nothing but the lateral sulcus. Okay, or Sylvian fissure or Sylvian sulcus, both are same. So the Sylvian sulcus or the Sylvian fissure, it is consisting of a stem and three rami. Three rami. One is anterior horizontal rami, anterior ascending rami, and posterior rami. Okay, three rami, and one stem. Okay, so the junction you can identify anterior horizontal, anterior ascending, and the posterior ramus. Okay, so the stem is situated at the inferior surface and extends forwards and laterally from the anterior perforated substance to inferolateral margin. So this junction is called as the Sylvian point. Sylvian point, where it divides into three rami. Okay, so the three rami junction is called as the Sylvian point. So the stem of the sulcus intervenes between the orbital surface and the tentorial surface. So try to recollect the things which we have discussed in our previous class. So what I have discussed at the inferior surface, we have discussed anterior surface is called as the orbital surface and posterior surface is called as tentorial surface. So between the orbital surface and tentorial surface, we can identify this lateral sulcus. Okay, lateral sulcus, which is extending, which is extending forwards and lateral. Okay, it is extending forwards and laterally. Okay, then what happens to the posterior rami? Now we have seen anterior horizontal ramus and anterior ascending ramus. Then what happens to the posterior ramus and what happens to the stem? We will see now. So then coming to this, it is occupied in the recent state by posterior margin of lesser wing of sphenoid bone along with the spinoparietal signs, venous signs. So the three rami are, we have seen are anterior horizontal, anterior ascending, and the posterior ramus. Okay, posterior ramus is 7.5 centimeters long, extending backwards. It is extending backwards and upwards with an upturned end, which appears in the inferior parietal lobule. Inferior parietal lobule. This the area below the anterior horizontal ramus is called as pars pars orbitalis. Okay, just below this anterior horizontal ramus, this area is called as pars orbitalis. Then between the anterior horizontal ramus and anterior ascending ramus, this area is called as pars triangularis. Okay, you can see the shape of it. It is in the shape of the triangle. Okay, so it is called as pars triangularis. Then the rest of the area lying above the posterior ramus and extending between anterior ascending and the upturned end of the posterior ramus is known as pars posterior. Now you know the three areas. Okay, one is pars orbitalis, pars triangularis, and pars posterior. So what are the sulcus we have? Sulci we have seen. One is central sulcus of Rolando we have seen. Then Sylvian sulcus we have seen, or lateral sulcus we have seen. Three rama you remember. Then the area names also you remember. Okay, so that is about the parts of this parts between the rami. Understand? Then the lower lip of the posterior ramus of the lateral surface and the adjoining temporal lobe form the temporal operculum. Temporal operculum. Then so that is about the lateral sulcus. Then coming to the Parieto-occipital sulcus. Here you can identify Parieto-occipital sulcus. It cuts the superomedial margin of the hemisphere. Let me show you the sulcus over here clearly. Okay, so here you can see this Parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay, it cuts the superomedial margin of the hemisphere about 5 centimeters in front of occipital pole. It is just 5 centimeters in front of occipital pole and appears partly in the superolateral surface. Okay, so we cannot see clearly entire the sulcus extending, but we can identify only small part. This is nothing but the parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay, so the part and appears partly in the superolateral surface. It is surrounded by a gyrus. It is called as arcus parieto-occipitalis. Arcus Parieto-occipitalis. You can see the area which is covering the parietal sulcus, occipito-parietal or parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay, that area is called as arcus parieto-occipitalis. Okay, with the help of central, lateral, parieto-occipital sulcus and pre-occipital notch. So let me explain you the pre-occipital notch. So what is a pre-occipital notch is just in front of the occipital pole we can identify a small notch. So this notch is called as pre-occipital notch. Pre-occipital notch. So remember these four points. Okay, one is central sulcus of Rolando, lateral sulcus, pre-occipital notch, and parieto-occipital sulcus. So these 4 points, uh, they are subdivided. They are going to subdivide entire the cerebrum into 5 lobes. One is behind the central sulcus and in front of the parieto-occipital sulcus. That is nothing but parietal lobe. In front of the central sulcus, this is called as frontal lobe. Below this lateral sulcus, it is called as temporal lobe. Behind the parieto-occipital sulcus, that is known as the occipital lobe. Okay, so that is about the lobes and the main sulci which we can identify on the superolateral surface of cerebrum. Then coming to the frontal lobe, what we can identify in the frontal lobe are the frontal lobe presents four gyri separated by 3 sulci. Understood? Yet, so what is frontal lobe? In front of the central sulcus of Rolando, this part is called as frontal lobe. This frontal lobe, it is going to divide into 3 areas it is going to divide into 4 areas by 3 sulci. 3 areas in 3 sulci and 4 gyri. Okay, what are the 3 sulci we'll see now? First one is precentral sulcus. Precentral sulcus lies in front and parallel to the central sulcus, and the precentral gyrus intervenes between them. Okay, so enter this part is called as precentral gyrus. So precentral gyrus which is present between precentral sulcus anteriorly, central sulcus posteriorly. Okay, that is about precentral gyrus. Upper end of the precentral gyrus extends onto the medial surface. Let us see that. So upper end of the precentral gyrus extends onto the medial surface, involving the anterior part of paracentral lobule. So this area is called as the precentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus. So this precentral gyrus is motor in function. Motor in function. It regulates. It regulates. It is regulating voluntary movement. Okay, voluntary movements of the contralateral side and provides the principal origins of corticobulbar and corticospinal fibers. Corticobulbar and corticospinal fibers. Then we can identify superior frontal sulcus and inferior frontal sulcus. Superior frontal sulcus, inferior frontal sulcus. So these 2 sulci again, this frontal lobe is going to divide into 3 subareas, 1, 2 and 3. So here you have seen the precentral gyrus, and in front of the precentral sulcus 2 sulci are there. One is superior frontal sulcus, inferior frontal sulcus. These 2 sulci, they are dividing this frontal lobe into 3 subareas again. So what are the 3 subareas? One is superior frontal gyrus, then middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. Inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, so the inferior frontal gyrus is invaded by these 2 rami. What are these 2 rami? Anterior horizontal rami, anterior ascending rami. These 2 rami, they are invading into inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, inferior frontal gyrus. So that is about the frontal lobe. Understood now? Okay. So far we have seen the sulci and gyri of the frontal lobe, and now we are going to discuss about the parietal lobe, sulci in the parietal lobe. Okay, so please concentrate. So already you have seen the sulci and gyri of frontal lobe. Now we are going to see the sulci and gyri of the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe, it is going to divide it into three gyri by 2 sulci. Okay, 3 gyri by 2 sulci. What are 3 gyri and what are the sulci? Okay, 3 gyri, and we can identify two sulci. So the 2 sulci are One is post-central sulcus. Okay, it is very easy. Don't panic. So this is post-central sulcus, just behind the central sulcus of Rolando. So between the central sulcus and the post-central sulcus, that area is called as post-central gyrus. Post-central gyrus. So the upper end of the gyrus extends onto the medial surface in the posterior part of paracentral lobule. Posterior part of paracentral lobule. So this is the entire part of the paracentral lobule. So here you can identify the frontal lobe, which is present here. Okay, medial frontal gyrus, which is showing over here, and behind this is the area which the gyri, that is superior frontal gyrus, is extending. Superior parietal gyrus, sorry, superior parietal gyrus. So then coming to this post central gyrus. Okay, yes, post central gyrus is extending onto the medial surface, which is occupying the posterior part of the paracentral lobule. Paracentral lobule. Okay, so what we have seen is one is central sulcus, already have discussed, and this is post central sulcus. Between the central and the post central sulcus, that is called as a post central gyrus. Post central gyrus you can identify over here. So this post central gyrus is extending onto the medial surface exactly in the posterior part of paracentral lobule. Posterior part of paracentral lobule. Anterior part of paracentral lobule is occupied by precentral gyrus. Posterior part is occupied by postcentral gyrus. Okay, postcentral gyrus. So the post-central gyrus is, what is the function of this post-central gyrus? As we have discussed, So in front of the central sulcus, that is motor area. Behind the central sulcus, sensory area. Behind the central sulcus, that is sensory area. So this post-central gyrus is sensory in function. It receives cutaneous and proprioceptive sensory inputs from the thalamus and brings them to consciousness. So it analyzes, discriminates, and localizes different modalities of sensation. Okay, let us go deep and discuss about other two sulci. So other sulci are the intraparietal sulci. Other sulci is intraparietal sulcus. Okay, this intraparietal sulcus arises from about middle of the postcentral gyrus. Postcentral sulcus extends backward to the territory territory of the occipital lobe. So it is extending from the middle of the postcentral sulcus to the territory of occipital lobe. So what is the territory of occipital lobe? Parieto-occipital sulcus, parieto-occipital sulcus, and pre-occipital notch. We are just drawing an imaginary line by joining these 2 points. One is parieto-occipital sulcus and pre-occipital notch. So behind this entire area is occipital lobe. So this post-central sulcus extending from the middle of the intraparietal sulcus is extending from the middle of the postcentral sulcus to the territory of occipital lobe or occipital parieto-occipital sulcus and joins with the transverse occipital sulcus. It is joining with the transverse occipital sulcus. Okay, transverse occipital sulcus. I will explain you about this transverse occipital sulcus. Don't panic. So the intraparietal sulcus is dividing the parietal lobe into two areas. One is superior parietal lobule, inferior parietal lobule. So this area is superior parietal lobule. Below this intraparietal sulcus, this is called as inferior parietal lobule. So behind the superior lobe lies the arcus parieto-occipitalis. Arcus parieto-occipitalis. Where did we have studied? Surrounding the parieto-occipital sulcus, that gyri name is called as arcus parieto-occipitalis. Arcus parieto-occipitalis. So whereas the around the upper end of the parieto-occipital circle, then the inferior parietal lobule, this inferior parietal lobule is encroached from below upturned ends of posterior ramus of the lateral surface. Here you can identify the posterior ramus which is extending backwards and it is encroaching into the inferior parietal lobule, and this the end of the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, it is occupied by a gyrus called as supramarginal gyrus. Supramarginal gyrus, and the other end. So other end is superior temporal sulcus. Superior temporal sulcus also extending or encroaching into the inferior parietal lobule. So surrounding that superior temporal sulcus, superior temporal sulcus, that gyri name is called as angular gyrus. Angular gyrus. So, in the parietal lobule, we have discussed about postcentral gyrus, superior parietal lobule, inferior parietal lobule, then supramarginal gyrus, angular gyrus. Angular gyrus. So these things you remember. So in the frontal we have seen precentral gyrus, superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, inferior frontal gyrus. Then the sulci are precentral sulcus, superior frontal sulcus, inferior frontal sulcus. Then coming to the parietal lobule, one is post-central sulcus, intraparietal sulcus. Two sulci and gyri are post-central gyrus, superior parietal gyrus, superior parietal lobule. It is also called as inferior parietal lobule. Then in the inferior parietal lobule, you have seen supramarginal gyrus and angular gyrus. Okay, so that is about the parietal lobule. Now coming to the sulci and gyri of temporal lobe. Okay, so now we are going to discuss about this particular temporal lobe. So in the temporal lobe, we can see two sulci, and these two sulci, the superior and the inferior temporal sulci, dividing the temporal lobe into three gyri: superior, middle, inferior temples. Okay, superior, middle, and the inferior temporal gyrus. Okay, these two sulci, they are dividing the temporal lobe into three gyri. One is superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. So the sulci extending backwards parallel to the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, and then turn upwards and enters into the inferior parietal lobule, that is superior temporal sulcus, that we have discussed in the parietal lobule, which is extending or encroaching into the inferior parietal lobule, that is nothing but superior temporal sulcus. Then coming to the lower one is inferior temporal sulcus. So inferior temporal sulcus, it is almost parallel with that of superior temporal sulcus, but it is not encroaching into the inferior parietal lobule. Okay, so that is about the two sulci and the three gyri of the temporal lobe. Okay, then we are going to discuss about the occipital lobe. Okay, the occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe presents, so coming to the occipital lobe, it presents transverse occipital, lateral occipital, and lunate sulci. Remember this sulci name: transverse occipital, lateral occipital, and lunate sulci. So what is this transverse occipital, lateral occipital, and lunate sulcus? We are going to discuss now. So the transverse occipital sulcus arises from the superior-medial margin slightly behind the parieto-occipital sulcus. Slightly behind the parieto-occipital sulcus, this transverse occipital sulcus is arising. Okay, it is extending downward along the superolateral surface and joins with the sulcus, intraparietal sulcus to form posterior boundary of arcus parieto-occipitalis. So this is the sulci known as the transverse occipital sulcus. Okay, transverse occipital sulcus. Then the lateral occipital sulcus. Lateral occipital sulcus extending horizontally and divides the lobe into superior and the inferior occipital gyri. Superior and the inferior occipital gyri. Okay, then coming to the lunate sulcus. Here you can identify the lunate sulcus. It is situated just outside of the occipital pole. It is curved with the lateral convexity and sometimes meet the posterior end of calcarine sulcus. Here you can identify another sulcus. So here you can see this. Sometimes it may join to the posterior end of calcarine sulcus. Okay, so that is about the occipital lobe and its sulci. Then coming to this insular or central lobe. I just want to show you this. Central Sulcus, and here you can see the what is the sulcus name? Lateral sulcus of Sylvius. That is anterior horizontal rami. We can identify over here anterior ascending rami, and here you can identify the posterior ramus. Okay, so this is the posterior ramus, and here you can identify superior temporal sulci extending. Okay. Then coming to this insular or central lobe. So insula is a submerged pyramidal cortex, pyramidal shaped cortex. It is situated along the stem and the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. So we have just separated the lateral sulcus in order to see the insular cortex, insular cortex. Okay, it is also called as central lobe, central lobe. So apex of the insula is known as lamen insulae. Lamen insulae is directed below and in front. Below and in front we can identify the apex, and as well as, and it is continuous with the anterior perforated substance. A circular sulcus separates the insula from different opercula of the lateral sulcus. Okay, so remember just below this lateral sulcus of Rolando, sorry, below the lateral sylvian sulcus, we can identify the submerged pyramidal lobe, submerged pyramidal shaped cortex. Okay, it is also called as central lobe. So that is about the sulci and gyri of the superolateral surface of the cerebrum.